Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we are continuing on with our Unit 6 lectures, looking at the consequences of industrialization. In particular, we're looking at the Qing Empire of China. So please identify a challenge facing Russia and the Ottoman Empire. Qing China. So this is our last Chinese dynasty. So we're continuing on looking at topic 6.5 of our AP course description. Please explain how various economic factors contributed to the development of the global economy. I also want you to think about how these factors in the global economy will impact China. So let's think back. We know the Qing dynasty has been around for a long time now. They are going to have started in Manchuria, living north of the Great Wall, and will eventually conquer the Ming dynasty. The Qing will really maintain a lot of the political and social systems of the Ming. Traditional Chinese patriarchy, civil service exam, emphasis on agriculture. However, a couple of the changes that the Qing did institute would be a ban on foreign travel and trade would be lifted. Because if you remember, the Ming were reacting to the Mongols and thus cut off all access with the outside world. So the Qing will start doing trade with the world again. And we see that commercialization and urbanization will be expanded. And yet both those things are happening on a relatively small scale. In general, we see that China is in decline, just like the Ottomans are. By the 18th century, the Chinese bureaucracy was largely corrupt. Bribery, favoritism, cheating on the civil service exams was rampant. Qing rulers would aim to alleviate rural distress by lowering taxes and the labor demands, but the gap between the land owning and the peasant classes is just going to grow. Public works will not be completed or will be in disrepair. For example, in the 1860s, the Yellow River will flood the Shandong Peninsula and thousands of peasants will die of famine and disease. Food shortages and landlord demands will prompt massive migrations westward. And by 1800, the population strain had caused severe environmental damage in some parts of central and western China. So you see a lot of anger and frustration. Minority populations are being angry about being driven off their land. Some villages even will start to discover themselves because everyone basically distrusts the government. The assumption is that all bureaucrats are corrupt, and the increasing presence of foreign merchants and missionaries didn't help restore trust either. So if you're thinking about our dynastic cycle, right, the mandate of heaven, all of these things are pretty standard for an end of that cycle, right? Typically, all of these things would show up right as a dynasty ended and a new one would arise. However, the big difference now in the 19th century is that China isn't really existing in a vacuum and is no longer the most dominant power in the Eastern Hemisphere. Now you have Europe. Well, China is going to be largely focused on itself. So the Chinese leadership, the emperor, and those at the top still really think of themselves as the most powerful and significant, and don't really take Europe very seriously. This is problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, it means they aren't paying attention to what the Europeans are bringing in. Europeans and Americans are making so much wealth, in part by smuggling opium into China. And the silver from this will be used to finance the Industrial Revolution. So in 1729, there will be a law banning opium. Opium, if you don't know, is made from poppies. It's the same it shares the same origin as like heroin. So it's addictive, it's makes you useless, right? Essentially, Britain in particular was acting as a drug cartel, bringing in opium, even though it was really harming the Chinese population because so many people were becoming addicts. So in 1729, the government says, hey, no more opium. It's now illegal, but it will still be smuggled in. The British and Chinese merchants will frankly benefit from the drug trade. Addiction will spread to people at all levels of the Qing society. The emperor and officials debated legalizing it and taxing it or enforcing the ban. In the end, they'll decide to root out the use and importation of opium and sent an official to the city of Canton to deal with it. So if you remember as well, the British and other Europeans were only allowed to do trade in certain cities in China. They weren't allowed full access. And this is something that had really frustrated European countries for a while now, because they consider themselves equal or even superior to China, and the fact that they weren't allowed to meet with the emperor and they couldn't build an embassy in the capital city was frankly embarrassing and hurt their pride. So Canton is one of the cities where they were allowed to trade. The British are going to be really frustrated by having to pay large amounts of silver for Chinese goods. To solve this, they are going to be pushing opium into China, and thus this ban will be viewed as intolerable, making trade really difficult and a direct threat to British economic health. So, the Qing Emperor will create two edicts. First of all, opium trade with Europe is illegal. Second of all, opium is to be confiscated and destroyed. So the official will go down to Canton to enforce these, dumping the opium into the sea and telling the British, we're not going to do business with you anymore. Instead, the British Empire will say, screw you, here are our drugs, we're going to do business, we're going to bring in drugs whether you like it or not. Thus, the Opium War. The British Empire will willfully dismiss the native desire in an aggressive pursuit of its imperialist goals. So you have what becomes known as the First Opium War, because in response to all of this, the British send in the Navy. So the First Opium War is a war between Britain and the Qing Empire that was started because the Qing Empire would not allow the British to be drug runners and bring drugs into their country. This doesn't seem unreasonable to us now, but to the British, it wasn't something they were going to put up with. So war will really reveal that the traditional Chinese soldiers are obsolete, right? China is still thinking of itself as the best of the best, and this war really just makes it clear of how backwards and far behind they've fallen. The British are technologically superior. They will land Marines, pillage coastal cities, and then move on. The Qing had no navy. They couldn't defend themselves. So the navy would just move up port by port, sending soldiers into the port cities and pillaging them. The Qing government couldn't even move their land forces very easily because the British were moving by sea. They couldn't keep up. They will bring reinforcements from central China, but these soldiers will arrive exhausted and without weapons. And the weapons they did have were muskets from the 1700s. The British had cannons, they had artillery, they had better guns, and they could move faster. So the Chinese then evacuated coastal cities inland and the British just sailed up the rivers. It's going to end with the Treaty of Nanjing. Essentially, it's an embarrassing treaty for China. It's really designed to be humiliating on the part of the British. So it will officially end the Opium Wars and will open up all of Chinese ports to the British. It will give the British special rights. It gives Britain a special trade status, and China has to pay Britain for the cost of the war. So Hong Kong is going to be a British colony dedicated to European trade. And you see what becomes known as spheres of influence. Spheres of influence are the ways Europeans forced China to open up trade and diplomatic exchanges and extend the rights of extend the rights of Europeans living in their states. So essentially, it's small pockets of colonization. In cities, foreigners would expand expat neighborhoods where the Chinese wouldn't even be allowed to live. You also have the arrival of missionaries along with all of this, right? The expanded access to trade also means expanded access to missionaries. Again, missionaries are a mixed bag. Some will really give back to the communities, but in general, missionaries will be viewed with distrust. They are going to be seen as undermining Confucianism because Christian missionaries will say, hey, no, we can't worship our dead ancestors. And the Christian missionaries will also say, hey, we need to stop doing the foot binding of women. The foreigners are just going to be resented in general because of the special privileges they have. If you haven't watched this crash course, you need to watch it in conjunction with this unit at some point. So, what challenges did the Qing Empire face? What was the Opium War? China's government is really struggling, right? They are really backward. Even with the Opium War, the leadership at the imperial level is still going to be really traditional, still really adverse to change, right? Even with all of this, the Chinese government isn't building railroads in their state. So you have the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion is going to be huge. It's a Christian-inspired rural rebellion that threatened to topple the Qing Empire. It will be started in a region that was experiencing agricultural instability, lots of poverty, and ethnic tension. So it will be led by Hung Shi Oqiuan, who will establish the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom with its capital in Nanjing. So who is this guy? Well, he's born poor. He will try to pass the civil service exams and fail repeatedly. This will eventually lead to a nervous breakdown. Then he will meet some Protestant missionaries. He will hear the gospel from them and misunderstand it greatly. He will view himself as the younger brother of Jesus, commissioned by God to found a new kingdom on heaven and drive the Qing out of China. Right? He believes that he is experiencing prophecies from God in his dreams. And his new religion will gain followers, the heavenly kingdom of great peace. They believe in prophecy via dreams, that they can walk on air and went in and out of ecstatic trances. They believe that the Manchus were creatures of Satan. So here's a thing to note, right? He is going to be of a different ethnic group than the Qing dynasty. Remember, the Qing are from Manchuria. They're a different ethnic group than the majority Han China. So part of this is ethnic tensions within China itself. The increased influence of European powers and the defeat of China in the Opium War will cause widespread dissatisfaction with the Qing government. So the Taiping instead proposed an alternative to the Qing dynasty. They will really attack traditional Chinese culture and thus the elite. They will advocate for social reform, land redistribution, and their version of Christianity. So eventually the Qing government will send in the military, and the Taiping will be able to withstand it. They push back the army, and this will increase the number of followers that they get. They will start to expand the amount of territory that they control as well, forcing villagers that they captured to join their religion or else. They monitored the people living in these villages to make sure that they were obeying this new religion, segregating men and women and organizing them into work and military teams. This movement will grow and spread, and people were scared of being forced to join. Eventually, the Taiping will conquer Nanjing and decide to make it their new capital. In the end, the Qing government will defeat the Taiping Rebellion. They will surround the city of Nanjing and try to starve them out, but this doesn't work. It's a port city. The Taiping will stay in Nanjing for more than a decade. Eventually, Europe will get annoyed with China for not paying enough attention to them, will conquer Beijing and force more treaties. But they will also deal with the Taiping Rebellion, sending in money and weapons to help the Qing government deal with this rebellion. In the end, an estimated 20 to 30 million people will die in this rebellion. It's the world's bloodiest civil war. Most of them will die of starvation and disease as cities are besieged. You hear stories of people being reduced to eating grass, leather, hemp, and even human flesh. And this will really devastate the agricultural center of China, leading to famine. It is also one of the reasons why in the 19th century you see a huge influx of Chinese immigrants into the United States. Many of these people were fleeing the chaos of the Taiping Rebellion in China. You should watch this video. It gives a really good summary. So, what inspired the Taiping Rebellion and how were they defeated? In the end, we see China is continuing to suffer and decline. They're basically bankrupt. The little infrastructure that they do have is breaking down and frankly a couple centuries too old. You see almost no industry, economically very backward, lots of debt and refugees. So you do have some people in favor of reform. Zhang Guofan is a provincial governor. He will hire foreigners to try and build up China and will send his children and other young people abroad to be educated so then they can bring their knowledge back to China to be used. And Empress Dowager Cixi will also be in favor of reform. Now, she is going to be viewed as corrupt and arrogant, but some of this may just be a reaction to a female ruler. Officially, her son's the emperor, but she's the one who held power. She is the one who will force modernization of China, building universities and railroads, but it's really too little too late. The self-strengthening movement, when the Qing officials and elite will encourage Western inventions and the modernization of the army, will be great, but it's not going to be enough to save the Qing dynasty. They will mobilize popular support by showing that the Taiping Rebellion does not represent a legitimate challenge to Qing rule. But the traditional Qing dynasty was weakened after repeatedly trying to withstand westernization and modernization. Let me give you an example of what this might look like. Empress Dowager Cixi is not the first person to say, hey, we should build railroads in China. But one of the main reasons why railroads were opposed is because to build railroads, you would disrupt and dishonor the ancestors, right? Because most people have a spot on their property where they honor, venerate their ancestors. So to build a railroad would mean you'd have to cut through people's property and these places of honoring, right? These places where your family for centuries have been honored and worshipped. The other idea too is that these spirits will then be upset by the noise and smoke of a railroad. So if we think about our three main land empires, this is a great video. It's really useful. She's a fascinating lady. As we think about our land empires, China, Russia, and the Ottomans, they will all face similar challenges, like the maintenance of political order and revenue collection, while simultaneously reckoning with problems caused by population growth and internal discontent. The subjects of the Ottoman, Russian, and Qing empires didn't consider European economic pressure a challenge during the first half of the 19th century. But by the 1870s, European challenges to the empires had become widely realized. For the Ottoman and the Russian empires, it was during the Crimean War. For China, it was during the Opium War. Although historians view the economic pressure as the force that weakened the empires, rulers of Ottoman, Russian, and Qing empires themselves considered their greatest challenge to be the European military superiority. Okay, let's do a couple practice questions. The population pressures in China during the late Qing Emperor were caused by when the British banned the importation of opium. When the Qing banned the importation of opium, the British The Opium War exposed the fact that the Qing land forces, the Bannermen, were like the janissaries of the Ottoman Empire. The Taiping Rebellion. So, please explain how various economic factors contributed to the development of the global economy, and consider how the global economy influenced and impacted China during our time period. If you have any questions, please ask. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.